Well, dear listener, Muscatine has entered the darkest timeline. Welcome to the Pearl City Podcast. I am your host, Taylor. Today we'll be talking about the structural instability plaguing downtown and threatening to destroy the town's history. We're talking about the Sheriff's Department's contract with the federal government for detaining ICE prisoners, and as a Muscatine historian, we will cover what I am quite confident is the worst thing to ever happen in Muscatine. So, not a sunny episode today, but when there's good news, I'll report on that. Beginning downtown on 2nd Street, in the great flood season of 1851, a mother and her 2 children were tragically swept away by flash flooding in Muscatine's Papoose Creek. The creek was eventually contained underground with the construction of a sewer tunnel. The creek quickly faded from memory, marked only by a plaque in Muscatine's downtown, but now, some 175 years later, Papoose Creek has claimed 2 more victims. Historic buildings erected on the rogue body of water's former banks. Their costly and protracted demolition, a result of the foundations sinking into the creek bed, started the chain reaction of condemned buildings and inspections which have left much of 2nd Street, the heart of downtown, evacuated. With passions running high, the community have rallied to support both the closed businesses and, more importantly, the displaced residents of the downtown apartments. Affected buildings are being slowly inspected and declared safe to occupy, but many priceless buildings remain evacuated with no information about their structural integrity or a timeline for their responding. I am really grateful to see the community rallying to support downtown. It's good to see that people actually care. I'm not trying to be funny. Downtown Muscatine means a lot to me, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the structures that we have lost over the years. Most of them demolished in order to meet parking space requirements. And so to see even more of these buildings being taken down is sad and disheartening. I'm finding sentiment about the city's response to this to be sort of mixed. I see a lot of people talking about a lack of transparency. The questions that I have asked to have not been met with the most straightforward of answers either, I'll admit. And it would appear that the criteria for reopening these buildings is not adequately being communicated to the people who need to know that information. So that's a bummer. The Muscatine County Jail is detaining ICE arrestees, often in defiance of federal judges' orders, and making a pretty penny doing it. My belief that this story deserves a detailed, thorough coverage is offset by the strong emotions that this situation inspires in me. To put it bluntly, every time I try to write or research this, I get so upset that I stop. But since my discomfort is nothing compared to the suffering of those affected by this evil and repugnant campaign of ethnic cleansing, I will mention 3 of the most outrageous cases. A local man who was shot during an armed robbery and subsequently arrested for unpaid parking tickets. An asylum seeker from Bolivia who was detained without a hearing for nearly 2 years and is now fighting deportation to a completely different country. And a Sudanese man detained for nearly 2 years without a hearing who was transferred to Muscatine suddenly without notice to his family or attorneys. All right, our first reading today comes from the Associated Press. Days after he nearly died when an assailant shot him during a robbery attempt, Felipe de Jesus Hernandez Marcelo went into an Iowa police station hoping to get his belongings back. Police in Muscatine, Iowa had his car and the cash he was carrying when he was shot and nearly killed on June 21st. Hernandez, 28, recalled in court testimony that the department said he couldn't have those items back. Instead, police arrested him on an old warrant for failing to pay a traffic ticket. Within hours, Hernandez was turned over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. A few months earlier, Muscatine Police Chief had assured the city, where roughly 1 in 5 residents is Hispanic, that his officers would never inquire about immigration status. He insisted that any resident who is a victim or witness of a crime should not be afraid to contact our department, and promised that officers would only work with federal immigration authorities in cases involving violent criminals. So that was a fucking lie. Our next clipping from KWQC in Davenport. Federal prosecutors in Iowa are continuing their push to deport to the Democratic Republic of Congo a Bolivian asylum seeker who was unlawfully jailed in Muscatine County. Court records indicate that Jose Ugar Cruz, age 36, entered the United States from Bolivia in July 2024, fleeing what he said was torture at the hands of officials involved in the drug trade. After entering the United States on foot at the Arizona border, he surrendered himself to immigration officials and applied for asylum based on the threat of persecution. In January 2025, a judge ruled the U.S. government could not send Ugar Cruz back to Bolivia due to the ongoing threat of torture. For the next year, however, immigration officials continued to hold him in jail while looking for a third-party country to which he could be deported. On December 3rd, 2025, Ugar Cruz was transferred from a Minnesota jail to the Muscatine County Jail in Iowa. 9 days later, Ugar Cruz's attorney sued the Muscatine County Jail administrator as well as Homeland Security officials, alleging that they were violating federal law by continuing to detain Ugar Cruz after the immigration judge had ruled in his favor. Ugar Cruz was released, but on April 8, 2026, ICE officials in Iowa contacted him at his Iowa City home and asked him to report to their Cedar Rapids office for address verification. Let's see how that goes. The address check was a ruse, one of the attorneys later told the court. ICE officers arrested him at the appointment. When he called his attorney, the ICE officer refused to tell his attorney what was happening. Ugar Cruz's attorney filed an emergency motion in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Iowa, seeking to immediately block ICE's acknowledged plans to put their client on a plane bound for the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, that man came here from Bolivia, now under threat of deportation to the Congo. I don't know if you're a geography fan or not. Those two countries are on different continents. Our final clipping today comes from the Capital Dispatch. Another longtime resident of Iowa is suing the federal government for being held in jail without bond pending his potential deportation. Noel Lopez de la Cruz, 23, of Mount Pleasant, a non-citizen who was allegedly Noel Lopez de la Cruz, 23, of Mount Pleasant, a non-citizen who has allegedly resided in the United States for more than 20 years since he was a small child, is suing the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and others in federal court. The lawsuit challenges what it calls the government's new draconian policy of reinterpreting the law to eliminate any possible bond hearings in immigration detention cases. According to court reports, De La Cruz first came into contact with Immigration and Customs Enforcement on June 9, 2025, at the Muscatine County Jail, where he was held on a warrant charging him with possession of marijuana. ICE placed a detainer on De La Cruz and took custody of him on August 16, 2025, when he was released due to the court's dismissal of the drug possession charge. De La Cruz is now in the Lynn County Jail, where he is being held on the charge of having entered the United States without authorization at the age of 3 and without a valid immigrant visa. Court records indicate the Department of Homeland Security has denied his request while his case is pending, an action that is consistent with a new DHS policy that took effect in July 2025. Under that policy, all ICE employees are to consider anyone who is alleged to have entered the United States illegally to be subject to mandatory detention. The cherry on top of the lives ruined, this is me talking now, came in March of 2026 when DHS authorized the release of their contract with the Muscatine County Jail in response to a FOIA request. Not by me. Shout out to actual journalists. It was revealed that the Muscatine County receives nearly $1 million annually for their unethical and apparently often illegal detention of ICE's captives. I I don't usually do this on this program, but I'm going to take a moment and briefly explain why I think this is bad. I don't usually do things like that because this program I tend to do it as though my listener already agrees with me on well, everything. But in the off chance that you don't, I want to make the case plainly and simply that anybody who walked to this country on their own 2 feet deserves to be here. That's a blanket opinion. I don't really care if they're bad, if they're criminals. We've got plenty of criminals right here at home, and we're not talking about sending them to a continent they've never been on. Although some of them I would support that. My point being that there is nothing that I, as a so-called heritage American, did to deserve my place in this country more than these people. This shooting victim, this marijuana arrestee, and this torture asylum seeker all have worked harder to be in America than me or anybody in my bloodline going back several generations. My great-great or great-great-great grandfather was a homesteader. You know, he purchased stolen land for pennies on the dollar, built a mud hut, and, you know, took pot shots at the Indians who got a little too close until the railroad arrived. And that's my American story. It's a lot less dangerous, a lot less inspiring even than somebody who fled their homeland for fear of their lives, only to come here and what is their reward for that but a nice stay at the real Hotel Muscatine, aka jail. I don't like it. I don't like it. Free them all. We close our program today discussing what I am confident is the worst thing to ever happen in Muscatine. And as a passionate amateur historian of Muscatine, I know a lot of bad things that have happened. So I'm going to conclude today's program by reading from my personal Substack, taylormeanswell.substack.com, entitled, Muscatine is Your Hometown Too, the local tragedy that must become a national wake-up call. 7 people, including children, were shot to death last week in the eastern Iowa city of Muscatine. Muscatine is indelibly connected to American history, from civil rights to labor militancy and even modern geopolitics. If you've ever sat under stadium lighting, drank a soda with corn syrup, or used ketchup in a restaurant, odds are you have consumed a product made in Muscatine. If you work in an office, there's a good chance that you have a desk or a filing cabinet from the Pearl City. Everyone in the United States is connected to Muscatine and ought to care about its people. While the case is still under investigation and their facts remain unsettled, this was written a couple weeks ago, these senseless and brutal murders appear to be a case of family annihilation. Family annihilation is a term coined by forensic psychologist Park Elliott Dietz to describe cases where the male head of household experiences a mental breakdown and murders his entire family. Half the time, the killing spree ends when the man turns the gun on himself, as was the case in this atrocity. The community are stunned by both the jarring violence and the human loss. While the investigation is ongoing, this quote from a neighbor published by the Quad City Times gives us disturbing insight into the killer's motive. I heard him walk by my house saying, "Don't worry about money. Everything goes away when you die," neighbor Melissa Wegan told the Quad City Times. As the dust settled, the same tired, ineffectual conversations about mental health and checking in on your neighbors feel inevitable. More pablum from the politicians, business, and faith leaders who, despite their power, insist that nothing can be done and encourage concerned citizens to turn inward and pray for a solution. Thoughts and Prayers discourse serves to distract not only from the leaders and the lawmakers who abide the atrocities, but also from the broader social issues that power them. Almost instinctually, I sense that many will recoil at the notion that this and other instances of family annihilation stem from what could be crudely called politics. But just like thoughts and prayers, calls to not get political in situations like this function as a smokescreen, diverting attention and responsibility away from those who have the power to enact change. Instead, we will take a direct, unflinching look at the way U.S. economic and foreign policy have driven working people to the edge of a cliff and exacerbated existing social inequalities such as the one between men and women. We owe it to the victims to be principled and uncompromising in our appraisal of this tragedy, even if doing so is unpopular. The National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities gives Muscatine County the 7th highest poverty rate in Iowa. Despite 7th place, Muscatine has more total families in poverty than the 6 counties above them. Per 2024 census data, U.S. median income is around $86,000, but in the Muscatine city limits, that number is reduced to a staggering $36,000 a year in median household income. While I acknowledge that domestic violence can, of course, occur in high-income households and that I don't know the socioeconomic position of the victims, I use these statistics to make the case that in Muscatine, just like in the rest of the nation, many people have their backs against the wall. This is the backdrop against which Muscatine's Art Center and Public Library announced in May that budget cuts from city and county government are forcing them to reduce hours and services. As a child growing up in Muscatine, the Musser Public Library was the sanctuary where I escaped my own unhappy and impoverished household. Sorry. For years, it was my routine to wake up to yelling, sneak out the back window, and ride my bike to the library. Why did my mother stay in that unhappy relationship for so long? Economics. I'm not claiming that the library budget cuts are responsible for the lives lost. I'm pointing out that they are both symptoms of a bigger problem: the ruling class squeezing working families for every cent. The exploitation of the poor is the handmaiden of patriarchal violence. English author Friedrich Engels observes that full freedom of marriage can only be established when the abolition of capitalist production and of the property relations created by it has removed all the economic considerations which still exert a powerful influence on the choice of a marriage partner. In other words, women and children are not free if they have to choose between staying in an abusive situation and risking financial ruin. The affordability crisis is linked hand in hand with the crisis of familial violence. I fear that the worse things get, the worse things will get. Do my bangs look like shit? Have they looked like shit this whole time? Ugh, I'm going to have to live with that. Thank you so much for tuning into today's program. Be sure to like, share, subscribe. You know what to do, and I hope to see you soon. Bye now.